I'm very happy to be a part of this most interesting conference. My talk is going to be on the ongoing crisis of cosmology and Vedanta. Now, what is the crisis of cosmology? Well, there are two aspects to it. One is that our models of the cosmos are based only on 0.5% of the observable universe. And what we mean by that is that because of the reason that we cannot explain the way galaxies are moving, and because of the fact that 25 years ago, it was discovered that the universe is not only expanding, but the expansion is accelerating. So for these two reasons, cosmologists have had to postulate dark matter and dark energy, which account for 96% of physical reality. And there is 3.5%, which is interstellar gases that we must set aside. So that becomes 99.5%. And the rest of it is only 0.5%, for which we have theories that correspond to what we see. Now, the problem is that there is not the slightest shred of evidence in support of either dark matter or dark energy. So this is the crisis. And then there are many other minor crises within this framework. For example, for a long time now, it's been discovered that the rates of or the value of the Hubble constant, which is the rate at which the universe is expanding, turns out to be different based on two different ways of measurement. One is the early universe view, which is where you look at the background microwave radiation and use that to estimate what the expansion rate is. And the other is by looking at specific stars of certain age and going back into time, looking at how much they have moved with respect to each other. And these two values turn out to be different. And that's what's been called the Hubble tension problem. Now, before, since in the introduction, it was mentioned that I've worked at the Hubble tension. Last year, I proposed based on a non-integer dimensionality model of space and a non-integer ontology of space, which was inspired by my study of Vaisheshik Sutras, which is, of course, a general, the term that we use is, of course, Vedanta, but Vedanta is just one of the darshanas, and the other one, Indian physics, is Vaisheshika. So inspired partly by that, and also work from logic, which there's a mathematical theorem which shows that binary is not optimal. In fact, you might know, those of you who do cosmology or physics, foundations of physics, that John Archibald Wheeler, well-known physicist who just died a few years ago, coined a very famous phrase, it from bit, that the universe emerges out of information. And as far as information is concerned, we generally take the view that it's a bit, it's either yes or no. But according to logic, it's not the yes or no representation of information that is most efficient. Rather, if you're looking at integers, it's ternary. So 0, 1, and 2 is more efficient. And in fact, in the 1970s, there were computer engineers who even attempted to build computer hardware based on ternary logic, because that would be more efficient. But eventually, it was abandoned because the the technology of binary logic, integrated circuits, etc., was too established, that to go beyond it and construct hardware based on ternary logic would have been too expensive. So somehow people assume that binary is optimal. It isn't. Ternary is. But even ternary, if you are prepared to grant real values, ternary is not optimal, but a value close to ternary is optimal. And that is E, which is 2.718. And so on. So E is optimal, and there's a very simple mathematical theorem which goes into it. And so since nature is optimal, and there is another theorem which I published last year, which argues that representation in E dimensions is optimal for data as well. So if nature is optimal, therefore, our view of three-dimensionality of space is just a convention. If you really think about it, what is fundamental to us is our sensory information, and it's the data that comes through our senses. So ultimately, information is fundamental. So this is something which joins up with what the previous speaker was mentioning. And this is the Vedantic view, that information or minds, it's the mind which takes in information, and information is fundamental. If information is fundamental, and if the optimality associated with it is E, therefore the convention of using three dimensions is not necessarily true. And if we use this logic, and if you say that the early universe data on which we get a certain value of the Hubble constant is governed by E-dimensionality, while the late universe model is governed by three-dimensionality, because that's where we impose a three-dimensional view on the data, then the Hubble tension problem goes away, and the values do come together. And this is something that I published last year in Scientific Reports, which is one of the journals of the Nature group. And there are many other things that we can put this idea of E-dimensionality, including explanation for why the mapping of the codons of the genetic code to the various amino acids is not uniform, because from an engineering point of view, they should be uniform. But if you consider E-dimensionality, then what we have is indeed true. So with this as background, let me speak of and tie up this loose end that I mentioned related to Vaisheshika as well, and bring in Vedanta. So let's go back to how I got into it myself. Many years ago, I was surprised to discover this is because, you know, just like most of you in India, we in India are not taught anything about the Indian scientific tradition. The Indian education presents a colonialist view of everything, including the sciences. So we Indians are not aware of what the Indian scientific tradition is. So I was surprised to discover a few years ago that in 1898, Vivekananda was in New York, and the great French actress of the day, Sarah Bernhardt, who was traveling to US with a group, threw a party in New York, and she also invited Nikola Tesla, who was the most famous engineer of his time, because he had just defeated in a courtroom Thomas Edison, related to what should be the standard for energy transmission. Thomas Edison was pleading for direct current, DC, while Tesla, who had invented the alternating current motor, was pleading for AC, and ultimately Westinghouse adopted AC, and that became the standard in the US and ultimately the world standard. So from that perspective, of course, we live in the age of Tesla. So the meeting that occurred, we have record of it, both in the letters that Vivekananda wrote about that meeting and the entry that Tesla made in his diary. So apparently what Vivekananda told Tesla was that, look, according to Indian physics, this is what he mentioned, or Vedic physics, the word that he used. And by that, he apparently meant Vaisheshika. He said, according to that, it should be possible to convert matter into energy. And since you, namely Tesla, Tesla's attempt for most of his life was to transmit energy and information wirelessly, and that in that he is a pioneer, in that he imagined how the entire world could be connected, just like what now, of course, is possible through the internet. But he had a vision of it. And but he didn't know how to actually transmit energy from one point to another. And that's where apparently Vivekananda knew about it. So he told him that, look, according to Vedic physics, this should be possible. And if you are able to establish it, not only would it solve what you have set out to do, it will also make it possible for the general public across the world to understand Vedic physics well. Now, I wrote something on it, and a story on it in Current Science Journal, where you'll have all the details. But this sort of piqued my interest, and I wanted to go further into Vaisheshika. And as you know, according to the Vedic view, if you were to imagine yourself in a room in space, there would be 6 walls, and these are the 6 darshanas. You're looking at reality, which is of course transcendent. According to the Vedic view, reality has 2 aspects: para and apara. Apara is what can be tied together through language, which is where you're talking of materiality or concepts. You can describe physical or abstract concepts and use language. And there are 5 darshanas that sort of, I'm sorry, you have the dichotomy of apara and para. Apara is what deals with knowledge, which can be tied with language, and para is the science of the experiencing self. So, in other words, using modern terms, Vedanta or Vedas divide reality into materiality and conceptual schema and consciousness. So these are the 2 aspects. And as you know, Schrdinger himself, the co-creator of quantum mechanics, told in his own autobiography, which he wrote in the 1950s, that the central idea of quantum mechanics, namely that of superposition, came to him in the 1920s when there was the crisis of how an atom is stable. Why don't the electrons fall into the nucleus, positively charged nucleus? So he finally, and why are the electron orbits stable? And that's what you needed after Bohr. You needed quantum mechanics to tie it all together. So Schrdinger said that the central idea came to him from the Upanishadic Mahavakya, I am Atma Brahma, that this Atman, this small, is a reflection of the entire, of everything. So the quantum state, this is of course an analogy, a quantum state should be a superposition of all possibilities. So this is one aspect of one leg, there are two legs, if you were to say, quantum mechanics. One is this, that there is superposition. The other is that when you interact with the quantum state, then you have access to only one of all those possibilities, which is what is called the collapse of the state function. And both of these have analogs in Vedanta, that firstly, yat pinde tad brahmande, as in the cell, so in the cosmos. This is that superposition that we are talking about. The other is the fact that the mind creates reality. Reality is out there. You cannot say what it is. You can only say what your mind has access to. And this is that dichotomy, or that dual aspect of reality, which is in an analogical way, is perfectly consistent with what quantum mechanics has said, which is the reason why there are many philosophers of physics, of science, who claim that quantum mechanics, the way it's expanded, is perfectly consistent with Vedanta. Now, knowing this all, I wanted to explore Vaisheshik Sutra much more. So what I did was, and there's no Indian physicist or any physicist who had looked at Vaisheshik Sutra, so I translated it, and this book is, of course, available. It's published 5 years ago. It's called Matter and Mind. And what I discovered was something absolutely incredible, that what Kanada, and this is maybe 500-600 BCE, what Kanada says is that you can look at, this dichotomy, or this dual aspect reality, materiality and consciousness. And that is, there's always these two, which are two aspects of reality. Now, as far as materiality is concerned, what Kanada says is that all that there is, it should be possible to explain using dravya, or substance, guna, or the characteristics of these substances. There are a few of these substances, and then karman, which is their motion. So that everything, all physical theory, should be based on substances, their qualities and motion. And there are, of course, these 5 mahabhutas, which is Prithvi, and these are not to be taken as earth, water, etc., but different aspects of materiality. Prithvi, apas, which is Prithvi, apas, tejas, vayu, and akasha. And every substance has all of these, which is, and the example is given is that if you take a bar of gold, which is solid, which is Prithvi, and you heat it, it becomes liquid, which means that the liquid, the atoms that, because this is also, Kanada's Vaisheshika Sutras are also an atomic theory. So the atoms associated with fluidity come to the surface or get projected, and that's why it becomes liquid. You heat it further, it lights up, so the atoms associated with tejas get manifested. And then as you keep on heating, it loses some energy, which it loses some mass. So that is when vayu gets projected. And these do correspond in an analogical way. And we are not saying that this means that Vaisheshika foretells modern physics, but they do correspond to the stable particles of proton, electron, photon, and neutrino. These are the 4 stable particles. And then akasha is, of course, the very structure of space. Akasha is where all this, these 4 reside in akasha, which taken together, these 5 taken together, is what the reality is. And now there are fascinating descriptions, and you can read them in the Mahabharata, for example, or you can also read them in this other book, which in my view is the greatest most fascinating. And I can say this with some authority because I have read an enormous amount of literature from all over the world, but there's nothing in the world which is as astonishing and amazing at so many different levels, even at the level of storytelling, as Yoga Vasishta. And Yoga Vasishta is not only stories, but also, and these are framed stories, but also a description of all kinds of conundrums and paradoxes that you have in reality in this larger Vedic framework. So what I've said is that it's the greatest novel that's been written, and some people don't like it. Some people look at it more as a kind of a, serious philosophical text, which is also another way of looking at it. So there are descriptions of what happens in both these and other places in the Vedic literature, that what happens at the time of the dissolution of the universe or at the time of creation. In modern physics, cosmology, creation is the Big Bang. And of course, now there are many other wrinkles to it as to what was there prior to it. Why did you have uniformity? And why did the symmetry break? Or and so on. And this other crisis that you have in modern cosmology is that with this accelerating universe, ultimately the whole universe will die a cold death, because objects, stars, galaxies will keep on flying away from each other, and ultimately there will be nothing. There won't be any, it'll all be dead. Which in the Vedic model of cosmology, the whole universe is created out of consciousness, and consciousness is the vehicle for consciousness is akasha, or the medium, and from akasha emerges, first of all, at creation, vayu, which if you take that analogy that I mentioned for some time ago, first will come the neutrinos, and then from there will come tejas, which is photons. At first, there'll be a wind of neutrinos emerging out of akasha, which is like the non-integer dimensional space. Because as an aside, you can also explain gravitation as a consequence of non-integer dimensionality. But that is something else. That's not Vedanta. So, and out of tejas, photons, then come electrons, and then out of electrons, then come protons, and then that's how the physical universe is constituted. Then there is evolution. The Vedic Vedas are totally consistent with all kinds of science. There's no dichotomy. It's not religion. It's a view. It's a view of reality. Okay, so this is how the universe is created. It takes its time. It evolves, and physical bodies evolve, etc., etc. And that's how that's where we are right now. Now, in Yoga Vasishta and Mahabharata and elsewhere, there are these descriptions of what happens at the other end when the universe dissolves, or there is a dissolution of the universe, which is pralaya in Sanskrit. So the whole idea then is very interesting, almost modern-looking, modern-sounding narrative. The sun, according to it, becomes larger and larger, which corresponds very fascinatingly to the whole idea of the sun becoming a red giant, becomes so large that the planets become a part of it. So the planets are destroyed. So according to this narrative in the Mahabharata, the sun becomes large, and all of Prithvi becomes apas. So all the materiality becomes liquidity. So all matter becomes electrons, and then it becomes, then this process proceeds, then all of that becomes light, photons, the opposite way, which is tejas. Then it proceeds, then all of it becomes vayu, and then vayu is taken in once again by akasha. So it all becomes a part of akasha. So very fascinating. So this view of cosmology it was inherent in the text, because as we know, and this is not only in the early Vedic texts, but the later Puranas, which have been much derided by Western scholars who read them, because Puranas are a coded narrative of all of these ideas in some kind of a jumbled way. And so one needs to have the key to make sense of it. As you know, in Puranas, one of the specific characteristics is that it should have, any of the Mahapuranas should have a section on cosmology, on how the cosmos was created. Now, you still have certain, I was looking at how much of time I have. I have 18 minutes. So I need to tie up many loose ends here. And since there might be some questions, so I should complete, let's say, in the next 12 or 13 minutes. So there are many questions. Now, first, all of this is an extraordinarily beautiful system which hangs together, this division of materiality and consciousness, which in a text such as Ishavasya Upanishad is called avidya. Materiality is avidya and consciousness is vidya. The Vedas call themselves Atma Vidya, or the science of consciousness. What the Vedic system says is that, look, you must create normal sciences or shastras based on what you observe, because this whole universe is based on logic, which is and laws, which is called Rita, and from Rita comes Ritu, or seasonality, because there are laws according to that, and so you can bind this all up through into various disciplines or the various shastras, but then you still have a question, and the question is, how do we have freedom? Where does freedom come in? And freedom is tied up with the whole question of consciousness, and that's the whole idea of Ishvara within us. So we have freedom within us, and this is something very paradoxical, that all consciousness is one. And Schrdinger writes very movingly on it, because he was all his life, he was a Vedantin. All of his life, he remained totally connected to this idea of the Vedic view explaining reality. And as you know, he was also, he played a critical role in the biological revolution, because his work, What is Life, influenced Francis Crick to go from physics to biology, and some of the ideas in What is Life were central to the explanation of the structural revolution that took place in biology. But the issue of where does freedom come in? So there is only one consciousness. There is one Atman. There is one Shiva, Shivoham. Every sentient being is Shiva's. But of course, what we perceive of this reality is through our mind, and mind is an instrument of our body. So there is this dichotomy of Prakasha and Vimarsha, light, which is Shiva, which is consciousness, and Vimarsha is its reflection in the hardware of the brain, which depends on culture, upbringing, this and that, and one's own predilections. So, but still, the question of where does freedom come in from? The freedom is inherent within us, but then how do we interrupt, so to speak, the logical flow, the scientific unfolding of reality? Because if there's an unfolding, then we cannot have any freedom. You know, this is a central philosophical problem that has existed for a long time, and the resolution to that is in an idea, a part of Vedanta, which is called Drishti Srishti Vada, or it's through Drishti that Shiva is able to transform reality. That if you observe, the process of observation changes reality. And in fact, this is at the basis of what we have even in Bengal. You have Durga Puja, all reality is goddess, which means Prakriti, which means nature, which means laws. And the more you explore it, the less you are able to find Ishvara within, because the Ishvara is always on the other side of materiality. So, and that's why in its representation, or at the puja, you find Shiva laying without any energy, because you cannot, all the energy has got to be a part of the goddess. Now, in Srividya, for example, which is a representation of the cosmos or energy or the goddess, Shiva is just a bindu, infinitesimal bindu right in the middle. Now this, my friend George Sudarshan, leading physicist of our times, came up with a theory in the 1970s, which is called quantum Zeno effect, where he was able to show that just by observation alone, without exchange of any energy, the observer can steer the state of a quantum system. It can either, he or she can either freeze the state of the quantum system or steer it to whatsoever, wherever the observer may want it to go, which is precisely equivalent to Drishti Srishtivad. By just observation, you can control a system. So this is where Ishvara, or this is where your consciousness comes in. How is consciousness able to steer the system? So there is freedom, but this freedom expresses itself in a paradoxical way. So, so what we find then in Vedanta is a view which at the level of cosmology is able to, first of all, speak, if one were to go back to old narratives, speak in broad terms as to how reality emerges. And I'm sort of amused sometimes that people who look at Nasadiya Sukta and other or Hiranyagarbha Sukta and so on, then they immediately write books because they don't know physics well enough. They write books and saying that, well, Big Bang is foretold in the Rig Veda. Well, the Rig Veda this is too simple. Big Bang is too simple. As I mentioned, there's a whole huge, horrible crisis in cosmology, in modern physics. That's too simple. I think making such analogies is pointless. One's got to understand the Vedic system in its most subtlety, in its most subtle way or subtle form, and also know physics a bit more. And then what we find is that what Vedanta provides you is, first of all, a resolution at so many different levels, a resolution at the individual level, which is something, as I mentioned, Schrdinger stressed again and again, individual level as to where freedom comes in from. How does this dichotomy of consciousness and materiality, these are two aspects, just as wave and particle are two aspects. You can't say that an object is particle sometimes or wave sometimes. You cannot say that the individual is a machine-like sometimes and free sometimes. These are two aspects of the same reality. Consciousness or Prakriti and Purush are two aspects of the same reality. Shiva and Shakti are two aspects of the same reality. Or in one's own understanding, you have Prakasha. Shiva is also called Prakasha, or light, in this beautiful system called Kashmir Shaivism, which is Vedanta, which is Vedanta like other Vedantas. You have Shankara's Vedanta, for example, but Shankara's Vedanta stresses for the individual, it stresses this whole idea of focusing only on the Brahman, Jagan Mithya, Brahma Satya, Jagan Mithya, that this world of appearances is an illusion. The only reality is Brahman, and therefore you might well, the teacher might say that, why don't you just focus on the Brahman? And I think this is really a kind of a very narrow way of looking at this, because you can also say that Jagan Mithya means that it's fleeting, it's transitory, which of course it is, but behind that, of course, is the self, which is non-transitory. And what Kashmir Shaivism says is that, well, all reality is Shiva, and you can either look at Shiva, or you can look at the embodiment of Shiva in this physical reality of each one of us, so that you don't have to move away from the world and become a sannyasi. You can be a part of physical reality. You can be a full participant, just as the Vedic rishis themselves were in their own lives. They had families, they had this and that. So it's a fuller, this is just interpretation. This is a more complete embrace of reality, of life as it is, that you don't walk away. But it is true, it's Vedanta, Vedanta as the essence or the end of the Vedas, or the heart of the Vedas. So to me, all of this, as somebody who also works in cosmology and information, to me, if we now are confronting this crisis of cosmology, where do we go? Should we, like many physicists, and I have many dear physicist friends who are spending years and years looking at different flavors of neutrinos, how these neutrinos might explain dark matter and dark energy, and no progress has been made. In my view, the resolution will come from a further unfolding of Vedanta into modern physics. And how might that happen? And here I'm telling you my own vision of it. You know, just as 120 years ago, in relativity theory, as it was created by, say, Poincaré or Einstein and others, the whole idea was that, well, you must bring the observer center stage to a certain extent, and it's the observer's perception of the speed of light being constant in whatever frame the observer might be in, which provided the central shift. So the observer, or awareness or consciousness, was given a certain larger role than what existed before, because in this mechanical clockwork system of Newton, for example, you have the laws of nature, reality, the three laws of motion, for example, but you're not talking of who is observing these laws. Incidentally, I must tell you this, that Kanada's Vaisheshika Sutras has two of these three laws almost exactly verbatim. You'll have the same words. There's one of the laws is that to every action there's an equal reaction. You know, it's incredible. And the third one is written in a more complicated way, and you should check it out for yourselves because of the principle. Trust but verify. You must verify all of these things for yourself. It's incredible that 600 years before BC, 600 BC, Kanada's Vaisheshika Sutras has this amazing sophistication. Yeah, I talked about something else about Kanada's Vaisheshika Sutras. Physical reality, of course, is Dravya, Guna, and Karman. But when the observers come in, because in all of the darshanas, the observer is a part. The other darshanas, for example, you have the Purva Mimamsa or Nyaya. Nyaya is logic. And Vaisheshika we already mentioned. Or Sankhya. Sankhya is description of reality in fundamental categories. And then yoga, where it all comes together, which is Sanatana Dharma, lived is yoga. So anybody who, you know, what is yoga? Yoga, in terms of religion, yoga is Hinduism, lived Hinduism, because yoga is, in the Bhagavad Gita, all that Krishna speaks about is yoga of different kinds. And then you have Vedanta, which is an overarching view of reality. So the other triad in Vaisheshik Sutra is Samanya, which is universal. There are invariances, universality. Vishesha, specific views of reality based on who and where the observer is. And thirdly, the third triad is Samavaya, the meeting of the observer and the observed. Prakasha and Vimarsha, the meeting point is where understanding takes place. It's not that we are always apart. You know, I personally, when it comes to consciousness, I subscribe to an ecological view. And I think that is the correct Vedic view, that we are in different states, and it's those states that lead to certain perceptions. It's not that information comes in and it's processed like a computer. It's not how that happens. That happens only in the mind, which is doing a rehearsal of what is transpired. But in reality, that's not how it happens. One just transitions from one state to another. In psychology, that's a model which is called, I don't know what it's called, ecological, I forget it, but by J.J. Gibson. And I think that is much more insightful than other computer-like models. So to tie it all up, Vedanta provides fundamental insights into the relationship between the observer and the observed. It brings in the observer into the system. And as we have seen, that was central to the development of quantum mechanics. And quantum mechanics is at the basis of all of the other sciences, you know, chemistry, and from chemistry go to biology to brain science. So it has already played a role. And incidentally, there are some historians, though personally I'm not persuaded, who suggest that the conversation that Vivekananda and Tesla had perhaps had some influence, because Tesla was the most famous physicist, Serbian physicist of his time, and Einstein's wife, her name, I forget, his first wife, was a Serbian, and she was a physicist in her own right. And the famous paper, a 1905 paper that Einstein wrote, originally had both his name and his wife's name. It's only when the proofs came in that he took his wife's name out. So people are suggesting that that she was in correspondence with Nikola Tesla, and he suggested this whole question of relationship of matter and energy, and that might have played some role in the work that the Einsteins did, and ultimately which led to the equation E equal to mc squared. Although, to be fair, there are many other scientists who are also somewhere out there, and as we know, Lorentz equations were already a part of Poincaré's work much before that. So it's this story is much more complicated than that. But I believe that the resolution that we need for the current crisis of cosmology will emerge by giving a more central role to the observer. And in fact, the non-integer dimensionality of space provides, at least, you know, I have some preprints on it already out there, provides an explanation of gravitational force, which, as we know, we have not been able to harmonize with the other forces of, you know, strong, weak, and electromagnetism, which have one model explaining them. And therefore, it has the potential then to explain where the history of our cosmos. And you can then see, if you adopt the non-dimensionality approach to reality, to space, then you can see why this acceleration that is taking place will eventually slow down, and in a few hundred million years, the universe will, firstly, the acceleration will slow down, then it'll start contracting, and which will conform to to a more realistic, let's say, on aesthetics ground, a cold death of the whole universe, that the universe keeps on accelerating and then everything goes nowhere, everything is finished forever. What does it mean? I think if you can explain that it all comes back together, and then you have these cycles, which is what is a part of the Vedic system. I think that on aesthetic grounds, if one can explain that in quantitative terms, and I think we do have the beginnings of that kind of a theory, that would be wonderful. So with this, since I've done about 50 minutes, I'll stop. And if there are any questions, if there's any time for questions, I'll be happy to answer them.